Well, welcome everyone to the Herbert C. Kellman Seminar. Just like to point out that the seminar is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. And before we get started, I'd also like to thank our team for making this seminar possible. We have Nicole Bryan, James Kerwin, Diane Long, and Billy Fairfield, and we are grateful for all of their help. And I also wanted to let you know that this seminar is going to be recorded. It's being recorded right now. So if you want to send it to, you want to let other people know about it, and maybe if you want to take a look at it again, what you could do is go on the Program on Negotiation website, and you'll look at events, click on events, and you'll see the Herbert C. Kellman Seminar. And that'll be up in a couple of days. So maybe early next week, if you'd like to see this again or suggest it, recommend it to other people. Also, I'd like to just explain the format. So we will have Dr. Papa give her remarks for about 35 minutes, after which we're going to open it up for a Q&A for you, the audience. And please, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Put your questions in there and we will take them, and I will actually present the questions to Dr. Papa. And before we get started and before I introduce our guest speaker, I wanted to just say that we all want to acknowledge the tremendous suffering in the Israeli-Palestinian community. And we also, many of us are asking the question, what would Herb do? What would Herb do in this situation? And so I made it my business this morning to go to the Mount Auburn Cemetery where he's buried and have a little chat with him. And I wanted to ask him, Herb, what would you do? And of course, he doesn't answer right away. So I was walking away from the gravesite, and all of a sudden, I got these words in my ear, and it said, and the words were, "Create space for hope to endure." So I'm just going to leave you with that. I just wanted to acknowledge what's happening to Israelis and Palestinians, and what he would do, it sounds just like him, is to try to create space for hope. So we have a completely different topic that we're talking about today, and we're thrilled to have Dr. Papa here with us. She's going to be talking about the BRICS alliance, the negotiation campaign for multipolarity, and the strategies and implications for the United States. As I said, we're thrilled because we really believe this is such an important topic for all of us to understand, and I'm sure she's going to shed a lot of light on this for us, and I think we'll be happy that we've attended the seminar by the end. Let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Mihaela Papa. She is a senior fellow at the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where she co-founded the Rising Power Alliances Project. And she's also taught sustainable development diplomacy there. She started her BRICS research as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Law School. Her recent publications include the development of a BRICS Convergence Index, Can BRICS De-Dollarize the Global Financial System? Coalition Dynamics in Global Policy, International Affairs, Global Environmental Change, and in other journals as well. Her BRICS-related commentary has been featured on BBC, CNN, Bloomberg, AP, News 24, and in various other media outlets. As a practitioner, Mihaela has extensive experience developing international collaborations in the government and nonprofit sectors. So I am so happy to introduce you to Dr. Mihaela Papa. And please, the floor is yours now. And I'm going to disappear.
Thank you so much, Donna, for inviting me, and thank you for the whole team. I'm really, really delighted to be here, and I really greet everyone. I see all the greetings from different countries, which is wonderful. I'm delighted to be here, especially because my BRICS research started when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard over a decade ago. And in my mind, BRICS has always been one of the most fascinating international negotiation puzzles. Because first, everybody expected it to fail, theoretically, policy-wise, because the countries are just so different. And also because informal institutions realistically become talk shops, so they don't really go that far. So, but big BRICS thrived. And secondly, if BRICS really works together as a coalition, they can form a critical mass of countries that can significantly impact both American power and global governance. And I also wanted to reflect, like on Donna, on your introduction, and thinking about the state of global governance today. Yesterday was Global Ethics Day. And it's always important, especially in these difficult times for global governance, for humanity, to think about what is common and what connects us, and also how we can, in the context of this larger topic of negotiation and conflict resolution, how can we all be better negotiators and prevent conflict and prevent human suffering. So with that, let me offer you some remarks on the BRICS and its surprising evolution, as well as the potential implications of it for both the United States and global governance. So allow me just to share screen. Let me see. All right. Can everyone see it? Yes? All right. So the title of my talk is BRICS Negotiation Campaign for Multipolarity. And today I wanted to talk about a research that I have been conducting for under the Rising Power Alliances project, which is a multi-year project. And it started in 2018 under Minerva Research Initiative federal grant. And we have been doing research to understand and investigate when, how, and why rising powers ally with one another, and also examine how these alliances and alignments and actually impact the US global leadership, and especially look at the group and the strategic mobilization of BRICS. So, of course, like all of my views are personal, and whatever I say today, it has no implications on the grant agency, or only on me. So in terms of what I would like to discuss, first, why look at BRICS? Why think about it as a negotiation campaign? And then how to even understand this BRICS mobilization. Then I would like to talk a little bit about the expansion of BRICS. And you probably saw the newspapers in August. That was like really front of the debates. And then finally on the implications for the United States. But to start, when we talk about BRICS, usually people think of two things. One thing is they think of economics, and they think of what are BRICS, and there is this sense of emerging economies, emerging markets. Although right now, like much after they were initially called emerging, they're not as emerging as they were before. The term emerging markets, we look back at International Finance Corporation in the 1980s, and basically when they were promoting first mutual fund investments in developing countries. But the actual connection with BRIC and emerging economies, emerging markets, was through 2001 Jim O'Neill paper, where Building Better Economic BRICS, where he was looking at BRICS as a group of countries which will have probable growth in relative GDP that will cause important implications for global governance. And basically the case he made was that when you have these emerging economies, unless you integrate them and unless you think about them in the context of global governance arrangements, then you are basically not able to manage economic affairs as efficiently. So there was this question of, you know, there are incumbent powers, but then there are rising powers. So how do you work with them? How do you coexist? How do you think about like new arrangements that will ensure that the economy evolves? So, but then the sense of when we look at BRICS as rising powers, here the question is more geopolitical. Can somebody who gets in economic power actually turn this power into political influence? And here we see that these are states seeking global status that corresponds to their growing economic and geopolitical clout, and also their potential to act as rule makers and norm setters in global governance. So when I talk about the BRICS group, we need to understand that BRICS started as BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and it was established as self-standing group. Initially in 2009, it was Russia that championed it. But then the first enlargement happened to add South Africa, and South Africa joined in 2010. And now today, when we talk about BRICS, we are talking about a group that has 41% of world population, 31.5% of global GDP, and 16% of world trade. So 2023, BRICS invites 6 new countries to join. But what was particularly interesting about 2023 is that there were 40 countries that expressed interest in joining, and there were 23 formal applicants. So these 6 are the ones that managed to get in. And they were invited, so they still need to accept the invitation and join. So it's still not completely over negotiation-wise. So, but when we look at BRICS as an institution, there has been quite a gap in understanding it. And it often falls under this blind spot, both in international relations and international negotiation literature. And the reason why is because often when we look at policy planning, it's focused on traditional, regional, bilateral relationships. And then on the other hand, what we are seeing now are these new types of informal relations that are close and that are trans-regional. And they're not really easy to place or describe or categorize. So because they don't fall into these alliances, which we are very used to, where you are basically competing and joining against somebody. And these are formal associations, so they need to have a treaty. And they are also not coalitions that happen like, you know, you have several states join and there is like coalition of the willing to do something, to do an intervention. So they fall in between. The way they are called more generally is strategic partnerships. And now today's era is supposed to be the era of strategic partnerships, where the formal relationships are less relevant and where countries are engaged in multi-vectorism, multi-alignment. They are engaged in issue-based convergence rather than basically getting tied and loyal to only a certain small group of countries. So when we look at, for example, this is a type of cruising or forum shopping that's kind of become typical for current types of close relationships, where you basically pursue issue-based convergence. So let's say India is in Russia-India-China partnership, in BRICS partnership, and in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So India would address different issues in each of these different groups. And then if it's not really, or it can address the same issue, but if it's not happy in one group, it goes to another group. But what happens that over time, it addresses a large number of issues in each group, and then different closer relationships happen and more entrenchment and more interactions and interlinkages. So this is a different model that is kind of more common now than it used to be before. But like when we look at BRICS mobilization in particular, we can call it a strategic partnership. It started as an intergovernmental minilateral institution. So it doesn't have a secretariat, no formal treaty. It has heterogeneous membership, so different ideologies. Some members are in conflict. And the idea for BRICS was to pursue ideas and not ideologies. And BRICS actually managed to establish its own institutions, new development bank, contingent reserve arrangement. And the reason when we think about like BRICS as a negotiation campaign is that there is a very clear negotiation target, the target goal, to create a more multipolar and democratic order and to reform global institutions, especially economic and financial infrastructure. So, and the idea is not only to do it for BRICS, but also to do it for developing countries. And the way BRICS operates is it is an informal institution. And in the larger context, informal institutions are now the platforms for mediating the rise of power and also renegotiating, creating multipolarity, so renegotiating US hegemony and its terms. When we look at the specific stakes of BRICS mobilization, you probably saw in the newspapers all like, is there going to be an alternate order, parallel order? What is happening when all of these countries join BRICS? So going back to Albert Hirschman, like a great theorist, he said that response to dissatisfaction, it can be dissatisfaction in organizations, it can be dissatisfaction in the order itself, world order itself, is to either work internally to improve the system or to exit the system. Right now, working internally is slow. The BRICS countries are not getting their voices as fast as they would want. Exiting the system is not fully possible because there is a dependence on it. So there are all of these different forum shopping strategies at play. But there is a negotiation campaign framework. And going back to James Sebenius, who said what we need to do is we need to look at the number of individual deals, how they are put together on multiple fronts to realize a larger result. And typically an ultimate target agreement with sufficient support to make it sustainable. So the way, if we look at BRICS from a negotiation campaign lens, it's very clear that there is a clear target goal. So we have multipolarity and democratization. And these are the ideas that serve as coalition magnets. But no negotiation campaign can survive unless you have a strong negotiation platform. So here the question is, so why is BRICS strong? I mean, how come that it did not disappear or just become a talk shop? Why is it continuously evolving? And we try to look at it, we try to actually measure and examine, conceptualize, and then measure BRICS cooperation. So we said like BRICS Convergence Index is something we developed to identify convergence building mechanisms and to start measuring what actually enables BRICS to stay together. So first of all, we said like institutional output. So is there international harmonization of policies at the BRICS level? So when they meet and when they decide to act together, is there like a harmonization of policies? Then we were looking at what are the types of actors engaged, because everything started at the intergovernmental level, but over time there was an engagement of civil society, of think tanks. So there is this whole like track 2 business going on in parallel to BRICS as an intergovernmental group. And then the other convergence building mechanism we looked at is subgroup dynamics. So if we say there is like a 5 group negotiation, and there is like there are things that are negotiated at the five member level, right? But how do you get to the five? So are these policy issues rising? So you have first bilateral, and then bilateral becomes trilateral, and then, or you have like a quadrilateral cooperation, and then they kind of go up. So that's something we were also looking at, and we were looking at like where cooperation exists that can kind of be a building block for larger BRICS cooperation. So with that, once we calculated like the convergence building mechanisms, then we looked at, okay, what do they say about BRICS convergence? And here I wanted to show you this table, and we selected 47 policy issues on which BRICS collaborate, and we track them from the start of collaboration between 2009 to 2021. And we gathered 2,444 observations, and BRICS cooperates on everything from sports to visas, but we looked at political economy, security, and sustainable development. So kind of these areas that are more strategic in terms of the kind of geopolitically, and in terms of the rising power, like major power relations. And what you see is here, year and state holding BRICS presidency, because it's a rotating presidency, and you can exactly see at what stages BRICS has evolved. But also here, a very major jump during 2015 Russia's presidency. And then we see kind of it stays strong. So if we look more closely where this jump is happening, we can see political economy trends, we can see security and sustainable development. So for example, institutional output is what they formally kind of agreed, like what they created. And the BRICS Convergence Index also has the subgroup cooperation and like different type of actors cooperation. So in some area, like for example, security, you do see a jump in 2015, but you can see that much of the jump is not to do more of the institutional output. So there is no policy harmonization. There is much more subgroup action, and there is much more transnational communication. But overall, what we found was the overall increase in BRICS convergence and the deepening of BRICS cooperation in every single area. And after 2015, a growing focus on security issues. The time of major institutional progress was Russia's BRICS presidency in 2015, where you can see measurable jump both in transnational communications and subgroup links. And then when we try to see, okay, what is correlated with what, transnational communication is positively associated with generating BRICS level institutional output. So basically, when you gather different civil society members, governments, business centers, academic councils, you get more institutional output. Subgroup collaboration does not have significant correlation. So basically, the group still operates very much on the top-down level. And then when we try to see for the same 47 issues, what are US policy positions, we got really interesting results. What we saw is that divergence from US preferences is not the norm, but actually over time consolidation has turned BRICS into a more potent negotiation force. And BRICS can also be mobilized to prioritize contentious issues. But overall, BRICS, the bulk of the BRICS cooperation, where the energy in the BRICS cooperation is very much around development-centered strategic partnership. So if you look at like BRICS convergence by theme, the top scores would be industrial development, climate change in the context of differentiated responsibilities, agriculture, UN development agenda. Of course, in terms of institutional output, finance, health is a big area of cooperation, trade, and also in terms of discussions, in terms of communication, trade, and UN Security Council reform. So we also found some common myths, like try to debunk some common myths about BRICS cooperation. Like, is China driving the cooperation? And our data says no, because some China's key agendas did not pass. Is India a side player? No. We found it to be a champion of collaboration, but also an advocate for a security agenda. Does India-China conflict undermine BRICS? On the contrary, we saw that BRICS helps de-escalate conflict. And internal processes focus on areas of agreement. So basically, you do not have like conflict is kind of compartmentalized within. In terms of the BRICS expansion, so these are the countries to which BRICS expanded, and they are supposed to join in 2024. The questions that this expansion raises are the following. If you make the group bigger, is it going to evolve as well? What are the BRICS discourses versus actions? Are BRICS-led institutions going to thrive or not? And what happens with de-dollarization, so the transitioning to local currencies? So there are, I mean, we can look at these would be kind of the new members, and these are the current key players. So will expansion complicate consensus building? And right now we can see, we saw this long list of countries in waiting, but the fact that now you have a bigger group, it might be also more difficult to get other countries to join and to agree who should be joining. But the most important part in terms of the evolution of BRICS from the last summit is that China actually is likely to play a greater role in BRICS, because after trying for a long time to accelerate the trade agenda, and actually China was championing expansion agenda, this is now the first time that you see that the core of China's agendas are aligned with BRICS. So that is geopolitically a difference. The question of discourses, on the other hand, is important because one thing that you see, especially in 2023, is strategic framing of BRICS as liberalization from marginalization of the global South. So a good example is Anil Suklal, South Africa's ambassador to BRICS, who says that you almost have a system akin to apartheid South Africa, where the minority decides for the majority. And that's still a situation on the world stage today. So, and basically that's an incentive for reform. Here we can also look at discourses. What are discourses regarding key conflicts? And also how this will change once you add Iran. Another question would be like, yes, there can be multipolarity, but what would BRICS do in terms of the rules-based order? Would BRICS provide global public goods? There is a legitimacy test. If BRICS says like we are representing global South, what does that translate to effectively? I mean, is the development accelerated? So to the extent that BRICS can act as a development accelerator. Another question is about the BRICS-led institutions. They have served as complementary, not as alternative to Western-led institutions. But now when we look at a bigger group, are there shifts in terms of funding of these institutions or participation in these institutions? So are all these new members going to be added to the institutions? And if we look at the BRICS Summit Declaration, the bank in particular is expected to expand. So, and then finally, the question of de-dollarization. That has been on the agenda for a very long time. And there is this like idea of transition to local currencies, but also transition to non-dollar currencies more generally. And for two reasons, one for the currency risk and one for the sanctions risk. And what's interesting, you see, the more the US imposes sanctions, the greater is the acceleration toward the de-dollarization agenda and championing of the de-dollarization agenda in BRICS. But what's interesting about the August summit is that actually the countries got homework to see how to basically accelerate work on this issue on local currencies. And the expanded BRICS is much more kind of in line in terms of like there is greater pool for trading, and it has countries that are interested in this transition to local currencies. So basically that agenda is likely to be accelerated. There is, I mean, at the same time, there was this big controversy about the BRICS currency, and the BRICS currency is not here yet, and it's not likely to be in the near future. But that indicated how these issues are both controversial, but also hard to implement. So finally, in terms of the implications for the United States, the first is like, does the US need a BRICS policy? And I would argue yes, because it's really important to be geostrategically aware of BRICS operations, because BRICS has become a really strong negotiation force. And it's important to understand how the United States negotiates with BRICS, with parts of BRICS, but also positions itself more broadly in global governance. In terms of positioning, there's a question of multipolar strategizing. So how does the US, what is the SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats of BRICS? Because BRICS might not only be like a threat, it can be a great opportunity too in some areas. So one area where there is a challenge, let's say for US negotiation power in the future, is if there is new regulation, US might not even be involved in creating it and then get like the full draft that's already supported by a lot of BRICS plus or a lot of BRICS related countries. How does BRICS impact the UN dynamic? I think more generally in terms of negotiation scholarship, there is a gap in understanding wedge strategies the second we get out of the security studies field. So is this like, is a wedge strategy policy something to develop? Or is it like the US would change the game rather than do the wedging? In terms of other implications, there is a larger question about what's the best way forward for US foreign policy. I would argue we need a strategic reframing of US foreign policy aspirations and innovation, because the US foreign policy has been really stuck between America first and America indispensable narratives. So is there like a third way foreign policy that can be sustainable development foreign policy that's very strategic about meeting basic needs, but also advancing economic, social, and cultural rights that can actually push forward the development aspect much more? And then the question of where do we anticipate increasing pressure on the US? One is, given the BRICS Convergence Index, definitely with pressure to live up to its climate responsibilities, but also the pressure in terms of a standard setting in outer space and the competition that will happen. I wanted to also raise several things to watch out for. One is there is this escalation of tensions, and it risks a breakdown in communication among major powers. Even like when you look at like who shows up at what events, we need to ask, will leaders be at the same table, and how to ensure that there is the same table. We do need to preserve bargaining space to jointly reimagine global governance. And overall, I think these are all kind of very high stakes issues, very controversial issues. And I do hope that this is one area where negotiation and conflict resolution can really be a field that helps everyone try to find areas of agreement, try to find commonalities, and try to prevent further polarization and potentially further violence and war. So I think with that, I would like to thank you and turn over back to Donna.
Okay, thank you so much. I love it that you ended on a positive note about how this could improve the world order. So thank you very much, Mihaela. First, we have some questions that we have people have asked. The first one here is, what are the main challenges faced by BRICS countries in their efforts to promote multipolarity, and how do they address internal conflicts within the alliance?
I can probably start with the second one first. Internal conflicts are not addressed. The way it works is that the agenda countries propose issues they want to discuss, and discussions do not, if a country feels that an issue crosses its red line, so to say, then that issue is not on the agenda. So you need to have consensus about what goes on the agenda. And the person who drafts the agenda is the president, the chair for that year. So right now you have South Africa chairing. So the summit was in South Africa, and next year it goes to Russia. So basically, unless there is agreement, the conflict is not part of the agenda. So we have also seen that with conflict within BRICS, so China, India, and that also was not discussed by BRICS. So basically, everything goes on between them, and then they just come in and it's like at the UN. They just pretend everything is fine. So they focus on different issues. So that's how they manage. I think in terms of challenges for multipolarity, BRICS has several challenges. One is that there is this internal power dynamic. There is quite an asymmetry in terms of power within the group. So we can see that in terms of China's effort to create a big like free trade zone within the group, but other countries were not as eager because China has asymmetrical power. Another challenge is the question of course, like how much emphasis, how much political capital they're willing to put in. When President Bolsonaro was, for example, elected, he wasn't that interested in prioritizing BRICS. So that was one era where BRICS did not flourish. So there is this combination of the human capital, of political will, of leadership, that goes into understanding like how far they can go on the multipolar front. But I think personally, especially now that BRICS expanded, it's not necessarily that it will be a stronger organization to exert pressure if they want to change regulation or if they want to create something new. It's going to be much more complex negotiation process, and it's also going to risk creating subgroups that can launch off and do their own thing. So we need to look at it from both sides.
Yes, thank you. Speaking of new membership, one person is asking you to comment on Iran and Argentina membership of BRICS. This person lives in Argentina, and this is a huge issue. So could you comment on that?
So I think it was very interesting to look at the debates in Argentina, especially because Argentina applied and was invited, but it's different presidential. I believe Argentina has elections soon. So there is this tension, like, what is BRICS becoming? Because before these other countries, like the new additions joined, you could say BRICS was like non-ideological, pursuing new ideas. But now when you have Iran, when you have much more of the discourses that are maybe more anti-Western or anti-American, then the question is, are you aligning yourself with these discourses that in a different way than you were initially intending? So that's a concern. I think with Iran, what we can see is that Iran has a very strong relationship with Russia and China. And that's not from yesterday. That has been built through different diplomatic maneuvers. And basically, this is the kind of the rationale for Iran is in a way from when you look at Chinese or Russian statements is like that Iran needs to be socialized back into the international community, and they are basically trying to socialize Iran. So BRICS had this big like parliamentary meeting. So there were people from Iran's parliament, people from Brazilian parliament. So there is this idea that you do not want to have countries isolated, but you want to be socializing them. And of course, it depends on how different countries perceive who needs to be socialized or not. So that part gets very controversial.
Right. Okay, thanks. The next question is, given the dynamic nature of international relations, has there been any recent discussion within BRICS regarding the possibility of opening the group to even more member countries? If so, could you share any insights on the conditions or the criteria that BRICS might consider if it decides to expand its membership?
So that's a very interesting question, because that actually shows that BRICS operates as a club and not as an organization. Because see, if you are, first of all, just the idea that you have formal joining into an informal institution is kind of a conundrum, right? But we need to understand that BRICS operates like a club. So if you want to join, there need to be people inside who want you, and there need to be people inside who will not veto you. So you need to have really good friends and not so great enemies. Which means, but let's say theoretically, during the BRICS summit, BRICS said that they developed criteria, but they didn't publish criteria, because at the end of the day, it depends who wants you and who blocks you. So it's interesting that at least like communications wise, they tried to make it look like the criteria exist. But on the other hand, you exactly know, like, for example, from national presses, national newspapers, who was for whom and who blocked whom. So the question about like, why not enlarge to everybody now? There is a concern like that you want to have an agenda. What are they going to do? I mean, what are they going to do differently? Right now, in a way, they have a good thing going, the 5 of them. And they have some cooperation areas that they're trying to narrow down, establish, accelerate, and so on. But with the new expanded group, you can see that the effort is to look at trade, to look at transition to local currencies. And it's not an easy thing. So in a way, if you want to do a prototype, you want to do a prototype on a smaller group. And then if it works, you can start bringing in more people. Also, the question would be, what do you bring them to? Because there is BRICS group, and there is BRICS Bank, the new development bank. So if all these 40 are interested, this really gives you more room for maneuver. You can say, oh, you can be here in the bank, or you can do these projects with the group. But it also gives you an opportunity to test them. Who really wants to be in must probably meet some standards or do something that BRICS find appealing. So it is a complex question. And just the idea that now we have all this expanded group, that makes it even more complex to see like how to develop criteria for who's next.
All right, thank you. This question wants to know if you think that the foreign policy of the United States, particularly its involvement in certain wars, strongly contributed to and even motivated the birth and rise of the BRICS movement.
I think when you look at data, you look at a lot of like discourses around financial crisis that were the main motivator for these countries to join. Absolutely, when you look at the unilateral moves, That's one area that's very much criticized when you look at the US use of sanctions. So these are like large-scale unilateralism, use of sanctions, and like US engagement in financial crisis and this dependence on US monetary policy. These are the areas that really come out when you look at the discourses on why they started, when they started. But if there is this larger sense of the need to diversify global leadership. And one thing that always comes to mind to me is like you have the entire continent of Africa, and on the Security Council, it does not exist in terms of permanent members. So nobody, like not a single state from Africa. So in a way, like how can you even pretend that the system is updated or still relevant when that's the case?
Right. Well, thank you. So this next person heard a Brazilian academic who said that BRICS was good for Brazil because it allowed Brazil to speak to other important leaders at an important small platform when Brazil doesn't have a similar role in the UN or other organizations. And so its views are not noticed as much. What's your view of this observation?
I must say I have great respect for Brazil, especially I'm a sustainable development scholar. So for me, I always look at Brazil as this being this like birthplace of Earth Summit and so on. So, but I'll answer concretely for the regarding the question is, and I would believe that would be Oliver Stunkel who said that, but like the idea here is that there is almost like this competition for time with China, and China cooperates with very many countries. But then if it cooperates with you in BRICS, then you get special treatment in a way because you get more face time. Just to, if we think about the number of meetings, between 160 and 200 meetings are for every single year for BRICS. So basically, you get a lot of face time with China, with all of these countries. Even after Russia invaded Ukraine, that was the same amount of meetings. So basically, you can really get engaged if you want to develop relationship with China, if you want to grow through China, you can really get engaged at a different level. The other way this plays out is that you have a five-country group formally, but there is this subgroup cooperation. So when they meet, they also meet in subgroups, and you usually before BRICS meetings, you have all these like bilateral agreements signed or trilateral agreements signed around the BRICS summits. So that's also another area where you basically have the opportunity just to use the time to create more agreements that you would find valuable in the broader context of BRICS summitry.
Okay. So this next question asks you, do you think that it will be possible for other states to join the bank in the future, but without necessarily joining BRICS?
Yes. I'm not, so just a disclaimer. So right now, Bangladesh, I believe, is in the bank, but not in BRICS. So the bank, joining BRICS right now, you do not have very clear criteria. But if you want to join the bank, you really need to pay, right? There is a very clear entry cost. Okay. So that's a difference. Who is willing to put in the entry cost? Versus right now for BRICS, you don't have a cost. So I think that's part of the calculation. But I think an important part is also to see how whether BRICS itself, so BRICS as a group does not have a secretariat, but will that mean that the BRICS-led bank will be an anchor institution for cooperation? Because if you link them much more closely, it will be very clear you either together or you are like somewhere else. So that might be a possibility where you have where you will eventually, for like next entrance, need to say either you are all in or you're out. So
yeah, okay. Here's an interesting question. They're all interesting. This person wants to know, are China and Russia mellowing their authoritarian styles with BRICS?
I mean, when you look at China and Russia, what's interesting is that they have their own agenda, and then that's much different than the overall BRICS agenda. But then they tone some parts down when they're working on a joint BRICS agenda. So in a way, like I'm not sure I would say mellowing. I would maybe say that there is this like consensus building where they test what's feasible from their bilateral preferences to basically plug into BRICS. And it's not that always they get positive feedback. So they get pushback as well as like sometimes other BRICS are interested in what they are offering, but other times they're not. So that's something to be considered.
And you mentioned the emphasis on democratic, principles. How do China and Russia react to that? Because you said you pursue ideas and democratic ideas. So what was that?
I think that's a great question. I think when you look at a joint statement where BRICS explained initially, BRIC explained what they're going to do, there is this term democratic. And every time you listen to BRICS leaders, they always say, oh, we are 41% of population. We have all these citizens. So in a way, there is this like intellectual connection. We are representing all these people. We are formal representatives. So if we are 41% of population, we need to have 41% of global policy making ideas and leadership. So that's the kind of the intellectual flow here. And there is a difference between democracy at the national level and what would democratic society mean, kind of the global democracy at the global level. So maybe if you think about it, like you can think about it like there is a DEI movement in the US, but what would like DEI mean if you put it at the global level? So whose diversity, whose equity and inclusion would need to be in a certain global leadership, or even kind of more broadly, kind of global policymaking spectrum?
Yeah, that's fascinating in and of itself. DEI at the global level. So thank you for that. So here's another question. How do Western-oriented think tanks think through international political economy based on the framework and assessment you have done on BRICS?
You mean like how the think tanks are considering BRICS? So
I think so. I think that's what this person means.
I mean, to be honest, like my co-author for Can BRICS De-Dollarize the Global Financial System is now in CFR. So some of the people who worked on the project are now in think tanks. So they're kind of continuing part of this research. But generally, I can say what we're trying to contribute. And then we see that like some of the work is taken up or cited, or, we get opportunities to interact. But what we are trying to do at Fletcher is to increase the level of debate and understanding about BRICS, about how these different new types of informal institutions that are not easy to characterize, how they operate and what it actually means in negotiation language and from negotiation perspective. So that's our contribution. And especially when you look at a lot of these debates are very much like, oh, the Third World War, like, so they go very bombastic very quickly. So what we are trying to do is to put data back in and see what is feasible, where are areas of convergence, where are areas for divergence. Yes, there may be challenges, but there are also opportunities. So how can you build consensus that basically gets the system in the right, pushes the system in the right way?
All right. So in your opinion, what are the future prospects for BRICS as a force for multipolarity and international relations?
I think here the question is about content of cooperation, but it's also about process. In terms of content of cooperation, a lot of prospects will depend on whether there is measurable accelerated development. So can you actually say that they contributed something measurable to global governance, global public goods? And it's not only if you look at top-down level, it's also like bottom-up. So where are the differences? I can give you an example. Like if you say like digital inclusion, financial inclusion, so many people don't have access. Can you trace access to BRICS policies, so BRICS agenda? So that would be where you look at what's measurable that makes world a better place. Not only like, okay, who is fighting whom, or who has more power, or who is on which seats. So I think that would be one area where I would see progress.
Yeah. And what do you think it would take to extend this multipolarity negotiation platform to all countries, corporations, and other groups?
It would take a lot of negotiation, but is it really the best way? Because every time you extend, the question is, okay, there is UN, so do you need BRICS to become the new UN? Or, would you have BRICS become like a UN minus West? So every time you expand parties, you expand transaction costs, and there is funding involved. So which institutions, I wrote a paper a long time ago, reduce, reuse, and recycle institutions. So are there any institutions that can be reused and recycled, rather than like creating everything from scratch and adding more funding and time and effort, if there is something that can already be useful?
Yes, thank you. All right, I think this is going to be the last question. What implications does the BRICS group's negotiation campaign have for U.S. foreign policy?
So first of all, it has the implication that U.S. It's not going away. It's a permanent force now, and that's a geostrategic implication for the U.S. But it's also an implication that the U.S. needs to think very long and hard about its own innovation, where it wants to be, because this is not time to be reactive. It's time to be proactive, to think about, in a multipolar world, what is the ideal foreign policy that meets the interest of American people and also makes the US a good global citizen. And that's a time for reimagination. So I think I would argue that the most important implication is how to reimagine American foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a very nice place to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Papa. And I'm now going to turn it over to Nicole Bryant, who will be sharing with you some upcoming PON events.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna and Dr. Papa. Thank you for this informative discussion. We had so many wonderful questions in the Q&A. I regret that we did not have more time to get to all of them. Thank you for this very complete discussion. I'm going to very quickly conclude by letting you know about two very exciting events that we have coming up in November. First, Harvard Law School's own Professor Sharon Block, Executive Director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy, is going to talk to us about hot labor summer / fall / winter and all of the incredible things that have been going on in terms of negotiations there. And then on November 8th, Alexander Herman and Nicholas O'Donnell are going to talk to us about negotiations in the context of art restitution, and specifically focusing on the case of the Parthenon marbles and that dispute between the British Museum and Greece. So Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. We hope to see you at a future event or perhaps at one of our executive education courses, some of which are listed on this slide. We always appreciate having such a lovely audience, and the recording will be live in just a few days in case you didn't get to see the beginning or want to share with a friend. Thank you, everyone, and we'll leave with a message of hope for everything that is going on. I will echo Herb and Donna's sentiments on that regard. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.